He offered his hand to the Baroness, who, descending, took it with a peculiarity of manner imperceptible to every one but Monte Cristo. But nothing escaped the Count's notice, and he observed a little note, passed with the facility that indicates frequent practice, from the hand of Madame Danglars to that of the minister's secretary. After his wife the banker descended, as pale as though he had issued from his tomb instead of his carriage. Madame Danglars threw a rapid and inquiring glance which could only be interpreted by Monte Cristo, around the courtyard, over the peristyle, and across the front of the house, then, repressing a slight emotion, which must have been seen on her countenance if she had not kept her color, she ascended the steps, saying to Morrel, "Sir, if you were a friend of mine, I should ask you if you would sell your horse." Morrel smiled with an expression very like a grimace, and then turned round to Monte Cristo, as if to ask him to extricate him from his embarrassment. The Count understood him. "Ah, madam," he said, "why did you not make that request of me?" "With you, sir," replied the Baroness, "one can wish for nothing, one is so sure to obtain it." "If it were so with M. Morrel." "Unfortunately," replied the Count, "I am witness that M. Morrel cannot give up his horse, his honor being engaged in keeping it." "How so?" "He laid a wager he would tame Medea in the space of 6 months." "You understand now that if he were to get rid of the animal before the time named, he would not only lose his bet, but people would say he was afraid, and a brave captain of spy cannot risk this, even to gratify a pretty woman, which is, in my opinion, one of the most sacred obligations in the world." "You see my position, madam," said Morrel, bestowing a grateful smile on Monte Cristo. "It seems to me," said Danglars, in his coarse tone, ill-concealed by a forced smile, "that you have already got horses enough." Madame Danglars seldom allowed remarks of this kind to pass unnoticed, but, to the surprise of the young people, she pretended not to hear it, and said nothing. Monte Cristo smiled at her unusual humility, and showed her 2 immense porcelain jars, over which wound marine plants, of a size and delicacy that nature alone could produce. The Baroness was astonished. "Why," said she, "you could plant one of the chestnut trees in the Tuileries inside. How can such enormous jars have been manufactured?" "Ah, madam," replied Monte Cristo, "you must not ask of us, the manufacturers of fine porcelain, such a question. It is the work of another age, constructed by the genii of earth and water." "How so? At what period can that have been?" "I do not know. I have only heard that an emperor of China had an oven built expressly, and that in this oven 12 jars like this were successively baked." "Two broke, from the heat of the fire, the other 10 were sunk 300 fathoms deep into the sea." "The sea, knowing what was required of her, threw over them her weeds, encircled them with coral, and encrusted them with shells. The whole was cemented by 200 years beneath these almost impervious depths, for a revolution carried away the emperor who wished to make the trial, and only left the documents proving the manufacture of the jars and their descent into the sea." "At the end of 200 years the documents were found, and they thought of bringing up the jars. Divers descended in machines, made expressly on the discovery, into the bay where they were thrown, but of 10 3 only remained, the rest having been broken by the waves." "I am fond of these jars, upon which, perhaps, misshapen, frightful monsters have fixed their cold, dull eyes, and in which myriads of small fish have slept, seeking a refuge from the pursuit of their enemies." Meanwhile, Danglars, who had cared little for curiosities, was mechanically tearing off the blossoms of a splendid orange tree, one after another. When he had finished with the orange tree, he began at the cactus, but this, not being so easily plucked as the orange tree, pricked him dreadfully. He shuddered, and rubbed his eyes as though awaking from a dream. "Sir," said Monte Cristo to him, "I do not recommend my pictures to you, who possess such splendid paintings, but, nevertheless, here are 2 by Hobbema, a Paul Potter, a Mieris, 2 by Gerard Dow, a Raphael, a Van Dyck, a Sorberon, and 2 or 3 by Murillo, worth looking at." "Stay," said Debray, "I recognize this Hobbema." Ah, indeed. Yes, it was proposed for the museum. Which, I believe, does not contain one? Said Monte Cristo. No, and yet they refused to buy it. Why? Said Chateau Renaud. You pretend not to know, because government was not rich enough. Ah, pardon me, said Chateau Renaud, I have heard of these things every day during the last 8 years, and I cannot understand them yet. You will, by and by, said Debray. I think not, replied Chateau Renaud. Major Bartolomeo Cavalcanti and Count Andrea Cavalcanti, announced Baptistan. A black satin stock, fresh from the maker's hands, grey mustaches, a bold eye, a major's uniform, ornamented with 3 medals and 5 crosses, in fact, the thorough bearing of an old soldier, such was the appearance of Major Bartolomeo Cavalcanti, that tender father with whom we are already acquainted. Close to him, dressed in entirely new clothes, advanced smilingly Count Andrea Cavalcanti, the dutiful son, whom we also know. The 3 young people were talking together. On the entrance of the newcomers, their eyes glanced from father to son, and then, naturally enough, rested on the latter, whom they began criticizing. Cavalcanti, said Debray. A fine name, said Morel. Yes, said Chateau Renaud, these Italians are well named and badly dressed. You are fastidious, Chateau Renaud, replied Debray, those clothes are well cut and quite new. That is just what I find fault with. That gentleman appears to be well dressed for the first time in his life. Who are those gentlemen? Asked Danglars of Monte Cristo. You heard, Cavalcanti. That tells me their name, and nothing else. Ah, true. You do not know the Italian nobility, the Cavalcanti are all descended from princes. Have they any fortune? An enormous one. What do they do?